Thank you very much, Juliette. My connection is lagging, actually. I'm seeing Dino's face talking on mute while Juliette's voice is out loud. So if that's okay with you, I'd like just politely to turn off my video and so that I can talk to you as clearly as possible.
Of course.
One question I had is, does the state of health emergency have any precedence in our history? And it gets back to French philosopher Michel Foucault that explained that in the West, we traditionally had two ways of dealing with pandemic, and as a consequence of controlling individuals. The first one was the model of exclusion of the leper, and the second one was the model of inclusion of the plague. And according to Foucault, the substitution of these two models of control is one of the great phenomena that took place in the 18th century. So why am I telling you that? It's because the 18th century is when statistics appeared. And now that we have big data, aka advanced statistics and advanced data analytics, we could ask ourselves if we're witnessing or not the popularization of a third model of individual control. So first, let me get back really quickly to leprosy and plague, interesting subjects, to understand how we went from exclusion to inclusion. In the case of leprosy, it was a model of exclusion which we can call a model of marginalization. That is, there's a social practice based on the rejection of leprosy patients beyond the city walls. And in this model, we were letting those who were infected to die outside the city, basically, in order to be sure not to contaminate the others, which can appear to be terrible and really discriminatory practice. And on the other hand, you have the case of plague, where the population is no longer rejected but confined within the walls of the city. That is what we basically call quarantine. So every day you had inspectors that pass in front of every house. They had to stop and call out. Each individual was assigned to a window, and he or she has to appear, and her or his name was called out. And if she or he was to report to the window, being understood that if he did not report, he was in bed, and if he was in bed, he was sick, and if he was sick, he was dangerous, and therefore something had to be done. And this is how the individuals were sorted out between those who were sick and those who were not. And this model of inclusion makes it possible to scientifically investigate the population in order to try to cure them. So basically, this is how we got from punishment to discipline. And Foucault described how the use of statistical tools have revolutionized the control of pandemics and individuals. And I believe this is really important in the light of government issues arising today. Because if you have to sum it up, the exclusion of the leper was brutal. It was a rough way to deal with the situation. There were no measures. Whereas in the 18th century, statistics made it possible to apprehend mass phenomena. Hence, the government used what we called back then political arithmetic to manage an epidemic. And statistics were understood as some kind of objective instruments of state control, making it possible to distinguish between normal and abnormal behaviors. So this is how Foucault describes how individuals' bodies became object of disciplines on which continuous corrective mechanisms are being applied. And this emergence calls it, as you know, biopower, which literally is exercising powers over the bodies, a power of normalization. So this introduction, just to tell you that, of course, I'm not Foucault. He's way more quick-witted than I am, but I'm trying to think, what would Foucault say today? And now that we have gone from statistics to big data, and extending his reasoning, I'm asking the question: is the 21st century is the century of the third age of individual control? Not that of exclusion, nor that of inclusion by confinement or quarantine, but that of inclusion by tracking. That is, of a certain freedom to come and go in return for real-time tracking and surveillance. Because basically, when we come to think about it, when you're confined, like for plague, you are in an inclusion model only limiting your physical freedom of movement. But when you are not confined anymore, and when you use an app, you become in an inclusion model which do not limit your physical freedom of movement, but can potentially limit your digital freedom. So the model of inclusion by tracking raises new challenges and issues. In appearance, it seems harmless because it is on a voluntary basis, but that might become binding and compulsory like it is in, I don't know, South Korea, China, or Israel, either by integrating it into common law or when an even bigger crisis, let's say randomly, an environmental one will occur, okay? So secondly, this shift would mean a transfer also, I believe, maybe a delegation of monitoring capabilities from states to individuals. We would have some kind of social peer monitoring. And more importantly, it could create new cases of discrimination. So every model, of course, leper, plague, COVID-19 actually showed new kind of discrimination. But as like you can think they disappear, they're just less visible, less tangible. So let me give you a concrete illustration of social stigma. The inherent philosophical problem of contact tracing or proximity tracing might be that it transforms a simple measure into a diagnostic. But the question we must ask ourselves, and I think Michael and Dino did, is how accurate would this measure be? So how can we avoid, for instance, false positive? Imagine a cashier that works behind a plexiglass window. She or he has mask on, gloves on, and that person will meet, I mean, like lots and lots of clients during a work day. So some of those clients will, be infected, of course, but it does not mean that this cashier will be contaminated as well. And the whole problem of this proximity tracing or contact tracing can be that the definition and the qualification of proximity might not be accurate enough or like precise enough. Few questions maybe like how is proximity defined? Like how long would it last? What is the distance that should be taken into account? So we were discussing about is it 2 meters, 3 meters? Is the context of the measure be taken into account? And for each of these criteria, what is the precision and the reliability? Because at the bottom, by way of conclusion, everything is going to be about the reliability and effectiveness of the measure, right? So, in other words, if we do not define precisely the conditions under which the system can trigger a decision, there will be people forced to be put in quarantine, whereas they should not, and also this could amplify existing inequalities. And my personal belief is that the trivialization of the use of such technologies could result in accepting, in short or midterm, a possible application in different contexts, such as law enforcement or employee control. And I believe those apps should not become some kind of, there's a lot of discussion around the immunity passport, but I would say in short, like we should not make it compulsory for any citizens, any user or any client. We should not make it compulsory to show some kind of green light before entering a shop, before benefiting from a service or going to work. And as a consequence, I would have just quickly 2 sets of recommendations, or like not recommendation, but food for thought. First, I think we should create dedicated multi-factors risk impact assessment. To implement responsible data sharing in time of crisis, we must create technological framework assessment that are adapted and tailor-made for COVID-19. I believe the 2 main and comprehensive framework that already exists are Convention 108 of the Council of Europe and maybe the GDPR. So let's assume, like, if we take as a basis a data protection impact assessment, we should upgrade it. We should upgrade it so that it deals perfectly with the legal and the ethical issues As such, a new right could be like not the right to access or the right to erase, but the right to turn off. In other words, to enable tracing only when wanted or when needed. That could be really helpful. Imagine, for instance, a situation in 2 months. So the confinement period is progressively resorbing or ending, where you could go to meet, I don't know, like for political, for religious or medical reason, anyone. You might want your app to be turned off at that particular moment. So I believe we should take this opportunity to create dedicated PIA and to strengthen them. A few comments and ideas on this. Firstly, I noticed that lots of people talk about PIA instead of DPIA. And this is surely because we often confuse privacy and data protection, which are actually two distinctive values. And also the fact that we always refer to privacy tend to make us forget about the other social values at stake that Michael and Dino talked about, such as due process, fairness, non-discrimination. So I'd like to suggest that if we upgrade those DPA, we actually need to integrate some kind of multi-factor impact assessment encompassing discrimination and other challenges such as digital divide, so to ensure that already marginalized populations are not put aside. And my last and final point would be, we lack legal standards around data anonymization. I believe this is really important. You all know that personal data is currently defined as any information that relates to identified or identifiable natural person, as opposed to anonymization, which constitutes an irreversible way to prevent identification. And as you know, case studies and research publications have shown for a long time how difficult it is to create a truly anonymous data set. And the problem we have here is that there is no international, no regional standard or referential around anonymization. One of the rare literature on the subject remains Working Party 29 Opinion 5 that dates from 2014, which let's say it's not really up to date to the current state of the art. And especially considering the progress made in fields such as differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, or other combination of cutting-edge techniques. So to finish on this note, I believe that like the Working Party opinion elaborates on the robustness of each techniques based on 3 criteria. Is it still possible to single out an individual? Is it still possible to link records relating to one individual to some of the data set, and can information be inferred concerning this individual? So the priority, I believe, should be defining what is the acceptable technological threshold from which a data could be deemed anonymized or not. And we should have a debate and upgrade that kind of 2014 framework on whether we believe re-identification of a person using such COVID-19 technologies that everybody's discussing today and more generally in the public debate. Do we believe that the re-identification of a person using such technologies is or not possible, taking into account all of the means reasonably likely to be used? And this maybe would be the way to promote innovation while protecting civil liberties.